March 6, 1944. At 28,000 feet above Brandenburg, Germany, Major Hans Kogler felt his oxygen mask freeze against his face as he scanned the sky. From the cockpit of his Messerschmitt Bf 109G6, he was leading a formation of fighters toward an American bomber stream his controllers had assured him would be flying unescorted this deep into the Reich. Then, a warning cut through his radio. Single-engine fighters with drop tanks 12 o'clock high. Panic rose in the voice on the headset. Kogler's heart sank. American single-engine fighters, here above Brandenburg, less than 50 miles from Berlin. It was supposed to be impossible. Every calculation the Luftwaffe had relied on said no Allied single-engine fighter could penetrate so far and still return to England. The P-47 Thunderbolt had a maximum escort range reaching only Aachen. The twin-engine P-38 Lightning could sometimes make it as far as Hanover, but not Berlin. The capital was considered safe. Yet here they were. Through the clear winter sky, Kogler now saw them. Sleek aircraft with squared wingtips and long, graceful lines. These were not Thunderbolts or Lightnings. They were North American P-51B Mustangs, and they flew with a calm confidence, carrying extra fuel, altitude, and the luxury of time to hunt. That day, 730 heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force were heading straight for Berlin. Not feints toward the city, not diversions, but a direct strike at the heart of the Reich. And for the first time in history, single-engine fighters would escort them all the way there and back. Kogler could not know it yet, but this moment would trigger the collapse of Germany's entire air defense system. Physically, strategically, and psychologically. The signs had been appearing for weeks. On January 11, 1944, Major Hermann Graf of JG-11 had encountered American fighters near Brunswick, 150 miles deeper into Germany than expected. His report suggested they must have refueled in Sweden, and Berlin dismissed it as combat fatigue. Yet sightings continued, Hanover on January 29th, Magdeburg on February 3rd. Each pushed the supposed range of American fighters further east. Still, the Reich Air Ministry refused to believe it. On February 15th, they issued an official order. Any reports of American single-engine fighters beyond the Ruhr were misidentifications of P-38s or friendly aircraft. Pilots who claimed otherwise would face medical review. But denial could not hide the truth. The Americans had not changed the laws of physics. They had applied them more creatively. At Wright Field, Ohio, engineers had extended the Mustang's combat radius to more than 650 miles using disposable drop tanks. This gave the P-51B a total range of 1,300 miles, something German experts had declared impossible. Obolt, Heinz Knocke of Jagdgeschwader 11 wrote in his diary in early 1944, "We had calculated exactly. The Americans could escort their bombers only 280 miles from England, no more. This left us central and eastern Germany as free hunting grounds. The Americans could not change the laws of physics, but they had in effect rewritten the Luftwaffe's entire playbook. The secret was twofold: the Packard-built Merlin engine and the British-designed paper drop tanks. The Packard V1653 engine was not only a licensed Rolls-Royce design, it was an improved version, built with American mass production methods that gave it unmatched reliability. Producing 1,490 horsepower at sea level, and maintaining more than 1,200 horsepower at 30,000 feet, thanks to a two-stage, two-speed supercharger. It gave the Mustang unmatched performance at high altitude. Oberfeldwebel Conrad Bauer of JG-26 inspected a crashed P-51B in February 1944. His report, later found in Luftwaffe archives, revealed the shock. The engine installation is a masterpiece of engineering efficiency. The intercooler system alone surpasses anything in our Daimler-Benz 605. Most astonishing is the quality. Every part is machined with precision like jewelry. Yet they claim Americans build 3 of these engines every hour. If this is true, the war will not be decided in the air but on the production line. Then there were the 108-gallon drop tanks, built from pressed paper coated with resin. They weighed just 35 pounds empty. They carried enough fuel for 5 hours of flight before breaking down. Far more than the 2. 5 hours needed to reach Berlin. German engineers had designed auxiliary tanks too, but always in heavy, reusable metal. They slowed their aircraft and made them vulnerable. The American tanks were cheap, disposable, and light. A Mustang with 2 drop tanks could cruise to Berlin, jettison them in seconds, and still fight at full performance. As Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke of the 56th Fighter Group explained, the Germans thought we had to conserve fuel for combat and the return trip. But with drop tanks, we flew like millionaires. We burned fuel freely, dropped the tanks, and still had a full load for half an hour of combat, plus the flight home. We no longer flew on the edge. We had a margin to burn. To understand how devastating this was, one must recall October 14, 1943, Black Thursday, when unescorted bombers were slaughtered over Schweinfurt. The Luftwaffe had built its strategy around repeating that outcome. But by March 6, 1944, the arrival of P-51 Mustangs over Berlin shattered that entire doctrine. It was the beginning of the end. When the 8th Air Force tried to bomb the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt without long-range fighter escort, the results were disastrous. Out of 2 non-81 B-17 flying fortresses that entered German airspace, 60 were shot down and 138 damaged. The loss rate was 26%, with over 600 airmen killed or captured. The Luftwaffe proved with brutal efficiency that unescorted daylight bombing was unsustainable. General Ira Eaker, commander of the 8th Air Force, was forced to halt deep penetration raids altogether. General Major Adolf Galland, General der Jagdflieger, declared October 14th the greatest victory of the Jagdwaffe in the defensive air war. In his memoir, The First and the Last, he wrote, "After Schweinfurt, we believed daylight precision bombing was finished. The Americans would have to adopt night bombing like the British, where accuracy was poor and damage limited. We had won the theoretical battle. But Galland, despite his tactical brilliance, made a fatal mistake. He assumed the Americans would accept the limits of current technology instead of developing new solutions. When reports surfaced in December 1943 of a new American fighter with unprecedented range, Galland dismissed them. When his own pilots claimed they saw single-engine fighters over Hanover in January 1944, he accused them of imagining things. Only on February 20, 1944, the opening of Big Week, did Galland begin to understand the threat. That day, the Americans launched 1,000 bombers escorted by 835 fighters, including large numbers of the new P-51B Mustangs. Over the next 5 days, the Luftwaffe lost 262 fighters, and far worse, 100 veteran pilots, 17% of its experienced force. Major Wilhelm Ferdinand Wutz Galland, Adolf's younger brother and commander in JG-26, admitted after Big Week, "The appearance of Mustangs changed everything. Before we could wait beyond escort range and hit the bombers at will. Now we had to fight through escorts just to reach them, and then fight our way out again. Every mission became a battle for survival." The morning of March 6, 1944, dawned cold and clear over northern Europe. Perfect flying weather. At Refleiston in England, ground crews of the 357th Fighter Group worked through the night preparing for the most ambitious mission yet, the first P-51 unit to escort bombers all the way to Berlin. At 0600 hours, Colonel Henry Spicer briefed his pilots, "Gentlemen, today we go to Big B. 4 hours over enemy territory. If your aircraft isn't perfect, abort now. There will be no second chances." None of the pilots aborted. Ironically, Spicer himself was forced to turn back shortly after takeoff due to mechanical problems, leaving Major Thomas L. Hayes to lead the historic mission. At 0830, 730 heavy bombers lifted off from bases across East Anglia. Behind them, 796 fighters prepared to provide layered escort. P-47 Thunderbolts for the opening phase, P-38 Lightnings for mid-range cover, and P-51 Mustangs for the final stretch into Berlin. The 357th launched 48 P-51Bs, but weather and mechanical issues meant only 33 reached Berlin. German radar stations of the Reichsjagddivision detected the huge formation as it crossed the North Sea. At Döberitz, the primary control center for Berlin's defense, plotters first assumed it was a feint. The Americans had approached Berlin before, only to strike targets in western Germany. Oberst Hannes Trautloft, commander of the 2nd Fighter Division, decided not to scramble until the bombers committed. By 11:30, the lead bombers crossed into German airspace near Arnhem. Escorting P-47s engaged Luftwaffe fighters in Holland and western Germany. Everything seemed to follow the usual pattern. The Luftwaffe pilots were cautious, waiting for the American escorts to turn back at their fuel limit. At 12:55, as the bomber stream neared Berlin, Major Hans Köhler led a mixed formation to intercept. His force included 7 twin-engine Bf-110s, pressed into daylight service, and 41 single-engine Bf-109s. German controllers had already seen the P-47s turn back and assumed the bombers were now vulnerable. Major Thomas Hayes and his 33 Mustangs broke through cloud cover and spotted B-24 Liberators below them. At the same time, they saw nearly 40 German fighters forming up for an attack. Hayes recalled, "They hadn't seen us. We had the altitude and surprise." I called to Greenhouse Squadron, "This is Greenhouse Leader. Bandits at 2 o'clock low. Drop tanks and attack." Feldwebel Jan Müller of JG-11, one of the German pilots, later described the shock. "We were in perfect position to dive on the bombers when tracers flashed past. I looked up and saw single-engine fighters with American markings diving on us. It was impossible. We were over Berlin. At first I thought they were captured aircraft. But then I saw dozens of drop tanks falling away. These were real American fighters with range we never imagined." The Mustangs tore through the German formation. Caught completely off guard, the Luftwaffe scattered in confusion. In just 12 minutes, the 357th claimed 20 enemy fighters destroyed without losing a single Mustang. Hayes himself downed a Bf-109 near Welsen, and later led strafing runs on a German airfield. At Karenhall, 50 miles north of Berlin, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring was having lunch when a call came from General der Jagdflieger, Adolf Galland. "American fighters are over Berlin. Single-engine fighters." "You're mistaken, Galland," Göring snapped. "Check again." Galland replied firmly, "Herr Reichsmarschall, I have confirmation from multiple sources. P-51 Mustangs are engaging our fighters over Potsdam at this moment." According to his aide, Oberst Günther von Brauchitsch, Göring exploded in rage. The impossible had become reality. American fighters were now over Berlin. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring hurled his wine glass against the wall and shouted, "This is treason sabotage. The pilots are lying to hide their cowardice. I will have every man who makes such claims court-martialed." But even as Göring raged, the truth could not be denied. From his own estate, he could see contrails streaking the sky above Berlin and hear the deep roar of engines at full power. His aide later recalled that Göring stood silently at the window for nearly an hour, staring into the distance. That same evening, he issued one of the most infamous orders of the air war. Any pilot who claims to have seen American single-engine fighters over Berlin is to be arrested for cowardice and spreading defeatist propaganda. The maximum range of American fighters is the Ruhr. This is a scientific fact. The order threw already shaken fighter units into chaos. Men who had just fought for their lives against P-51 Mustangs now faced the threat of arrest if they reported what they had seen. Several squadron commanders, including Major Karl Rahl, simply ignored the order, instructing their men to write twin-engine fighters in their reports instead. On March 8th, General Major Adolf Galland confronted Göring at the Air Ministry. He placed a piece of a P-51 drop tank on the table, clearly stamped "Made in USA," recovered near Magdeburg. Göring's reply became legend. "I don't care if you bring me a whole Mustang on a silver platter. The Americans cannot escort bombers to Berlin. It is scientifically impossible." Galland later wrote in his memoirs that it was at this moment he knew Germany had lost the war. At Nuremberg, Göring himself admitted, "When I saw American fighters over Berlin, I knew the jig was up." For individual Luftwaffe pilots, the Mustang's appearance over Berlin was more than a tactical shock. It was a psychological crisis. These were men told for years that Berlin was an impregnable fortress, and that German engineering was unmatched. Hauptmann Heinz Knoke, commander of the 2nd Squadron of Jagdgeschwader 11, wrote in his diary on March 7, 1944, "Yesterday changed everything. We always knew where we were safe, where we could regroup, and where we could strike without interference. That certainty is gone. If they can reach Berlin, they can reach anywhere. We are no longer hunters, but the hunted, even above our own capital." The shock was made worse by the Mustang's performance. The P-51B was not only present over Berlin, it was dominant. Its Merlin engine gave it a top speed of 437 mph at 25,000 feet, compared to the Bf-109 G6's 386 mph at the same altitude. Its laminar flow wing provided excellent high-altitude maneuverability, and its 6 .50 caliber machine guns delivered concentrated firepower. Most importantly, its pilots arrived fresh, not exhausted from fuel limits like German fighters often were. Unteroffizier Peter Pez of JG 301 survived a fight with Mustangs on March 9th, and later described it. They came from above and behind, always with altitude advantage. When we turned to fight, they climbed away. They had the power to go vertical whenever they wanted. If we tried to dive, they stayed on us. They flew like they had endless fuel, making multiple passes and chasing us down to low altitude. We were used to American fighters making one pass and leaving. These Mustangs toyed with us like cats with mice. Johannes Steinhoff, commander of JG 77, later wrote about the strategic shift. We had to assume every bomber formation had Mustang escort, even if we could not see them. No more careful positioning, no more large attacks. We had to strike immediately with whatever we had, accept higher losses and hope to reach the bombers before the Mustangs found us. The arrival of the Mustangs coincided with another crisis, the collapse of Germany's fuel supply. The Reich depended on synthetic fuel plants that converted coal into aviation gasoline using the Bergius hydrogenation process. These massive facilities were safe from attack as long as Allied bombers could not be escorted that deep into Germany. Without escort, precision bombing was impossible, and the heavily built plants survived. The Mustang changed that overnight. On May 12, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched its first major strike on the synthetic fuel plant at Luna, 100 miles southwest of Berlin. A force of 800 bombers, escorted by 735 fighters, including two 98 P-51s, dropped 1,918 tons of bombs with deadly accuracy. Production at Luna dropped to 90% in a single day. By June 1944, German aviation fuel production collapsed from 175,000 tons per month to just 35,000. By September, it was down to 7,000 tons, barely enough to support 500 sorties a day across every front. Training flights were cut back and then canceled completely. New pilots were rushed into combat with as little as 50 total flight hours, compared to the 250-hour standard in 1942. A veteran transferred from the Eastern Front described the grim reality. By summer 1944, we were allowed one training flight per week, then one per month, then none at all. New pilots arrived never having fired their guns in flight, never flown in formation, never practiced combat. They were lambs to the slaughter. We lacked fuel, experience, confidence, everything a fighter pilot needs. The true scale of the Mustang's impact became clear on June 6, 1944, D-Day. The invasion of Normandy required total air superiority over the beaches. The Allies flew 14 674 sorties that day. The Luftwaffe managed just 319, losing 35 aircraft. Over the beaches themselves, only two German fighters appeared. Oberst Josef Pips Priller, commander of JG-26, led the only Luftwaffe attack on the invasion area. With his wingman, Unteroffizier Heinz Wodarczyk, he made a single strafing run on Sword Beach before being driven off by Spitfires. In his memoir, Priller reflected, "2 planes, that was all we could send against the greatest invasion in history. Not because we lacked courage, but because we lacked fuel, aircraft, and above all, air superiority." The loss of air superiority over Berlin had sealed Germany's fate long before the Normandy invasion. Major Vero, who once commanded 3rd JG-54 and shot down a P-51 on May 24, 1944, later admitted, "After the Mustangs reached Berlin, we never recovered the initiative. From that day on, we were reacting, defending, and always outnumbered. The Americans could strike anywhere at any time with escort fighters. We could barely defend our own airfields. The air war was lost the moment they flew over Berlin." In desperation, the Luftwaffe turned to extreme measures. One of the most striking examples was the Sturmgruppe assault units. Focke-Wulf FW-190A8s were heavily modified with extra armor, 30mm cannons, and reinforced windscreens. These aircraft, nicknamed flying tanks, were designed to punch through Allied fighter screens and attack bombers head-on at point-blank range. Major Walter Dahl, who took command of JG-300 on June 27, 1944, became the most visible supporter of these tactics. On July 7, 1944, he led a Wienerkandersturm JG-3, supported by 2 Gruppen of Bf-109s from JG-300, in a massive assault against B-24 liberators near Leipzig. In less than a minute, The armored FW-190s destroyed a full squadron of 12 B-24s from the 492nd Bomb Group. But the victory came at a staggering price. 9 Sturm Group of fighters were shot down, and 3 more crash-landed. The escorting Bf-109 suffered even greater losses against the Mustangs. At first, these tactics caused brief successes, but as American fighter strength grew, they became near suicidal. Oberfeldwebel Konrad Bauer, one of the few Sturm Group of pilots to survive multiple missions, recalled bitterly, "We were flying coffins. The armor made us so slow that the Mustangs could attack us again and again at will. If our guns jammed, the order was to ram. But how could we ram when we couldn't even break through the escort screen? Every mission was Russian roulette with all chambers loaded." Germany's final hope lay in revolutionary technology. The Messerschmitt Me-2162 Schwalbe, the world's first operational jet fighter. With a top speed of 540 mph, it was 100 mph faster than the P-51D Mustang. In the hands of experienced pilots, it might have changed the air war. But the Me-262 arrived too late and in too few numbers. Worse still, Hitler demanded it be used as a bomber instead of an interceptor, wasting precious months. By late 1944, when the jets were finally cleared for fighter operations, the Luftwaffe lacked both the fuel to train new pilots and the secure airfields needed to operate them. Adolf Galland, dismissed earlier as General der Jagdflieger for criticizing Hitler's decisions, was placed in command of JV-44, an elite jet unit formed in February 1945. Even with Germany's best surviving aces flying the Me-262, they could not overcome Allied numerical dominance. Galland himself later explained, "We would take off, shoot down 1 or 2 bombers or fighters and return only to find our airfield under Mustang attack. They hunted us on the ground, catching the Me-262 during takeoff and landing. For every minute we were airborne, Mustangs were overhead for an hour. Technology without numbers, fuel, and infrastructure is worthless." By autumn 1944, the Luftwaffe was suffering what historians later called the death of the experts. Veteran pilots with dozens or even hundreds of victories were dying faster than they could be replaced. With Mustangs roaming deep into Germany, there were no safe zones for training, no quiet fronts where rookies could gain experience. The decline in pilot training tells the grim story. In 1940, new Luftwaffe pilots averaged 250 hours of flight instruction before combat. By 1944, this had fallen to just 80 hours. By early 1945, some replacements were being sent into battle with as little as 20 hours in type. Meanwhile, American pilots arriving in Europe had 400-500 flight hours, including 100 hours in their assigned aircraft and extensive gunnery training. Johannes Steinhoff, who survived severe burns when his Me-262 crashed on takeoff in April 1945, described the horror. "We were sending children to their deaths. Boys who could barely fly formation were thrown against Mustang pilots with hundreds of combat hours. That wasn't combat, it was murder." I stopped looking at the faces of the replacements. Most were dead within a week. The statistics confirm this. In January 1945, the average life expectancy of a new Luftwaffe fighter pilot was just 7 missions. Some units saw 100% turnover in a single month. JG-3001, once a respected unit, lost 82 pilots in the first 3 months of 1945 while claiming only 41 victories. Lieutenant Gay, who survived the war with 3 victories, recalled his first experience. "My first mission was meant to be a simple training patrol over Brunswick with experienced pilots. Before we even formed up, Mustangs attacked us. My flight leader was killed in the opening pass. I never even saw the Mustang that fired at me, only the tracers flashing past my canopy. I dove to treetop level and flew home alone. That was my combat training." While the Luftwaffe was bleeding out in the skies, American bombers were relentlessly dismantling German aircraft production. The Mustang's long range meant no target was safe. Major centers such as Regensburg, Augsburg, Vienna Neustadt, and Leipzig were hit repeatedly with devastating precision. Albert Speer, Reich Minister for Armaments and War Production, admitted after the war, "The Mustang allowed the Americans to keep constant pressure on our aircraft industry. We would repair a factory, restart production, and within days it would be destroyed again. We began dispersing production into caves and forests, but that reduced efficiency by 75%. We built more fighters in 1944 than in 1943, but losses were higher. We had neither the fuel to fly them, nor the trained pilots to use them. The numbers are revealing. German fighter production peaked at 3,300 aircraft in September 1944, but losses that same month were 3,217. Germany was literally losing planes faster than they could be built, even with the most efficient industrial system in Europe. Worse still, quality was collapsing. Aircraft rushed from dispersed factories suffered engine failures, structural weaknesses, and faulty weapons. Kurt Tank, chief designer of the FW-190, visited frontline units in December 1944 and was appalled. Planes were arriving with dangerous defects. Engines expected to last 100 hours were failing after 10. Control surfaces jammed. Guns were misaligned. We had gone from building the world's best fighters to delivering flying death traps. Workers were exhausted. Materials were poor and proper testing no longer existed. In effect, we were sabotaging ourselves. By the end, the Luftwaffe was crushed by a combination of lost veterans, untrained replacements, collapsing industry, and the relentless reach of the P-51 Mustang. On January 1, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, a massive surprise strike on Allied airfields in Belgium and the Netherlands. At dawn, around 900 German fighters took off, representing virtually all of the Luftwaffe's remaining strength in the West. Many of the pilots were flying their very first combat mission. Most had never flown in formations larger than 4 aircraft. The mission was kept so secret that German flak units were not informed, which led to deadly friendly fire losses before the fighters even reached enemy airspace. The attack achieved complete surprise. On the ground, 305 Allied aircraft were destroyed, and another 190 damaged. But the price for Germany was catastrophic. The Luftwaffe lost 271 aircraft and, more critically, 213 trained pilots, including many experienced leaders. Among the dead or captured were 3 Geschwaderkommandore, 6 Gruppenkommandure, and 14 Staffelkapitane. Arjen Kogler, one of the few to survive the mission, later described it as the Luftwaffe's death ride. We destroyed aircraft the Americans replaced within a week. We lost pilots we could never replace. And worst of all, we burned our last reserves of fuel. After Bodenplatte, we were finished. We could no longer even pretend to control the skies. The Allied response was swift and unforgiving. Within 48 hours, P-51 Mustang sweeps were hunting down weakened German fighter units. Airfields were strafed again and again. In the week after Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe lost another 400 aircraft, most of them destroyed on the ground. Major John Meyer of the U.S. 352nd Fighter Group, an ace with 24 victories, later recalled the period. It was almost sad. We would find German airfields filled with planes that couldn't even take off for lack of fuel. We strafed them, watched them burn, and there was no opposition. It wasn't combat anymore. It was execution. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe no longer functioned as a true fighting force. Individual pilots still flew sorties, but large-scale operations were impossible. The mere appearance of Mustangs above a German airfield often meant its destruction within hours. Some German pilots began refusing to fly, not out of cowardice, but from the simple knowledge that taking off meant certain death with no impact on the war's outcome. The psychological collapse was severe. Heinz Knoke, once a passionate defender of the Reich, wrote in his final wartime diary entry, "I have lost countless friends in this unit. Boys I trained, boys I flew with, boys I loved like brothers, all dead. For what? We can't even reach the bombers anymore. The Mustangs are everywhere. They own our sky. I am no longer a fighter pilot. I am a target waiting to be killed." The Luftwaffe's own records confirm the devastation. In January 1944, there were 2,395 fighter pilots available for operations. By June 1944, at the time of D-Day, this number had fallen to 1,323. By January 1945, only 742 fighter pilots remained. By April 1945, barely 200 were still flying. Of the Luftwaffe pilots who had been operational on January 1, 1944, fewer than 5% survived the war without injury. The appearance of the Mustang over Berlin marked the beginning of a complete annihilation that consumed an entire generation of German aviators. After the war, surviving Luftwaffe pilots were remarkably candid about the Mustang's impact. Their testimony, gathered by Allied intelligence officers and later historians, provides rare insight into the psychological collapse of a force once considered unbeatable. Adolf Galland, despite being dismissed during the war after clashing with Nazi leadership, remained one of the most respected voices on Germany's air campaign. In a 1954 interview, he explained, "The P-51 Mustang was the decisive weapon in the air war over Germany. It wasn't the best in every single category. The Spitfire turned better, the FW-190 rolled better, and the Me-262 was faster. But the Mustang was good at everything, and it could fly anywhere. Once it appeared over Berlin, we knew the war was lost. It was like a chess game where your opponent suddenly had queens that could move anywhere on the board." Johannes Steinhoff, who survived terrible burns when his Me-262 crashed on takeoff in April 1945, later became Chief of Staff of the post-war German Air Force and eventually chairman of NATO's military committee. His judgment was equally blunt. The Mustang didn't just defeat the Luftwaffe, it destroyed the very concept of German air superiority. We had built our entire defense strategy on the belief that Germany itself was beyond the reach of single-engine fighters. When that belief collapsed, so did everything else. It was not just a tactical defeat, it was a strategic catastrophe. One of the most emotional reflections came from Heinz Knoke himself. At a 1975 reunion of former adversaries, he met Colonel Clarence "Bud" Anderson, a triple ace with the U.S. 357th Fighter Group. Knoke told him, "When we first saw your Mustangs over Berlin, it was like discovering the ocean had no end. We had been told that we were winning, that America was too far away to harm us. Then suddenly you were above our capital with fuel to spare. It broke something inside us, not just our will to fight, but our faith in everything we had been told." Even Erich Hartmann, the highest-scoring ace of the war with 352 victories, acknowledged the overwhelming advantage of the P-51. Hartmann survived by relying on strict rules of engagement. He attacked only when he had every possible advantage, and disengaged immediately if Mustangs appeared. After the war, he admitted, "Fighting Mustangs was not combat as we understood it. It was survival. They had every advantage: numbers, altitude, fuel, and increasingly pilot quality. We could only hope to survive and perhaps pick off a straggler." The scale of the Mustang's impact can be seen in the final statistics. In the European theater, P-51 Mustangs claimed 4,150 enemy aircraft in aerial combat and destroyed another 4,131 on the ground. Together, this represented nearly half of all German aircraft losses to Allied fighters in the West. The Mustang was not just another fighter, it was the weapon that broke the Luftwaffe, shattered German morale, and ensured Allied air supremacy until the end of the war. On paper, the numbers alone showed just how decisive the Mustang was. P-51s were credited with 9% of all USAF fighter victories in the European theater. Loss ratios tell the story even more clearly. By 1945, the Mustang's average combat loss rate per sortie was just 1–2%, while Luftwaffe fighters were being lost at a staggering rate of 18% per sortie. Overall, the kill ratio stood at roughly 3–6 in favor of the Mustang. For bomber crews, the Mustang's arrival was a game-changer. Before its introduction, bomber losses averaged 1% per mission. After the P-51 joined operations, that number fell dramatically to 5%. In real terms, this meant a 68% drop in bomber crew casualties. Range was another revolution. The P-47 Thunderbolt could fly 375 miles on combat missions. The P-38 Lightning stretched that to 450 miles. But the P-51 changed the rules. The P-51B with drop tanks could cover 650 miles, and the later P-51D extended that to 750 miles. That range meant 100% of German territory was now within Allied reach. Production numbers also underline the difference. A total of 15,686 Mustangs were built, with peak output reaching 320 per month. Each cost about $51,045 dollars. By comparison, German fighter production in 1944 totaled 25,060, but at no point did the Luftwaffe ever have more than 2,500 fighters operational. Pilot training was another major gap. American pilots arriving in Europe between 1944 and 1945 averaged 400 hours of flight time before combat. German replacements in the same period often had only 80 hours of training. By 1945, the survival rate for Luftwaffe pilots was below 15%, while American fighter pilots had a 65% chance of completing their combat tours. The appearance of Mustangs over Berlin represented more than just a tactical victory. It marked a strategic turning point in warfare. For the first time in history, one nation could project overwhelming air power over every part of another major power's homeland. The consequences reached far beyond the battlefield. General Carl Spaatz, commander of the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, summed it up in his after-action report. The P-51 Mustang gave us air supremacy over Europe. Not air superiority, which means an ongoing contest, but complete supremacy. Total domination. By the spring of 1944, we could strike any target at any time with acceptable losses. This wasn't just a military advantage, but a psychological blow. German troops and civilians alike came to realize that Allied aircraft could reach any target at will. The effects rippled through Germany's war effort. Industrial paralysis. Factories had to scatter production into hidden, inefficient facilities. Transportation breakdown. Bridges, railways, and supply lines were constantly hit. Fuel collapse. Synthetic fuel plants, once thought safe, were systematically destroyed, triggering a vicious cycle. Less fuel meant less training, higher losses, and even less fuel to allocate. Ground dominance. With the Luftwaffe out of the skies, Allied ground forces advanced with far less resistance. German troops could only move at night to avoid destruction. Civilian morale collapse. The sight of silver Mustangs flying unopposed over the Reich's capital shattered the myth of Germany's invulnerability. It's important to remember that Germany had started the war with clear advantages. In 1939, the Bf 109 was arguably the best fighter in the world. German pilots were highly skilled, many with combat experience from Spain. Their tactics, like the finger four formation, were ahead of their time. But the Mustang was something different. It was the result of collaboration. A British Merlin engine, American mass production by North American Aviation using auto industry techniques, and continuous upgrades based on frontline feedback. The P-51D, which entered service in May 1944, included major improvements: a bubble canopy with 360-degree visibility, 6 50-caliber machine guns with better ammo feeds, the K-14 computing gun sight, stronger wings for heavier loads, upgraded radios, and the Packard V1657 engine generating 1,590 horsepower. Every feature came directly from combat lessons, creating a feedback loop the chaotic German system couldn't match. Dr. Kurt Tank, designer of the FW-190, admitted after the war, "We could design aircraft equal to or better than the Mustang. The Ta-152H was superior in many ways, but we couldn't build them in numbers, couldn't fuel them, and couldn't train pilots to use them. The Americans didn't just build a better fighter, they built a better system." The Nazi leadership's response only made things worse. Instead of focusing on fighters, Hitler demanded bombers. Instead of saving veteran pilots as instructors, they flew until they were lost. Pilots who reported the true situation were often punished. The decline of Germany's top aces reflected the collapse. Men who had become national heroes were gradually eliminated. Major Klaus Mitusch, with 72 victories, was killed by P-51s on September 17, 1944, after 452 combat missions. Oberst Walter Uso, with 123 victories, was downed by P-38s on May 11, 1944. Major Hans Philipp, who had scored 206 victories, was shot down by P-47s on October 8, 1943, before the Mustang's full arrival, but foreshadowing what was to come. The roll call continued as Germany's finest were taken from the skies one by one. In the end, the Mustang was not just another fighter. It was the decisive tool that broke the Luftwaffe, reshaped air strategy, and proved that victory came not from isolated brilliance, but from a system that combined technology, production, training, and adaptability into a single unstoppable force. By the time the war ended, out of 107 German pilots who had each scored 100 or more aerial victories, 95 were either dead, seriously wounded, or prisoners of war. The Mustang hadn't just beaten the Luftwaffe, it had erased its experience and leadership. As 1945 opened, the Luftwaffe was more an illusion than a real fighting force. Aircraft were hidden in forests, disguised as farm fields, or dispersed along makeshift highway strips. Pilots lived in constant fear, always on the move to avoid the Mustangs that seemed to be everywhere. Oberst Gordon Golob, one of the few senior officers still alive, issued desperate instructions. Aircraft were only to take off when enemy bombers were directly overhead. Maximum sortie length was set at 15 minutes, and if a pilot stayed in the air longer than 20 minutes, he would be presumed a defector. The fear of Mustangs became so overwhelming that many German pilots abandoned missions the moment escort fighters appeared. Courts-martial for cowardice became common, though executing skilled pilots when replacements were scarce only made the crisis worse. Morale collapsed completely once airmen realized that even successful missions changed nothing. The bombers always returned. The Mustangs always escorted them. And Germany's war effort kept crumbling. Lieutenant Heinrich Bartels, who had 99 confirmed victories, was shot down and killed on December 23, 1944, just one kill short of becoming a century ace. His wingman reported that 6 Mustangs attacked from above and behind. Bartels never had a chance. Even after his aircraft caught fire, they continued firing to make certain he was finished. This ruthlessness reflected the new reality of air combat. In the earlier years of the war, there had been a degree of mutual respect. Pilots who bailed out were usually spared, and damaged planes sometimes escaped. By 1945, however, American airmen had lost too many friends. They wanted to ensure the Luftwaffe could never recover. Every German pilot killed was one less candidate for the advanced fighters and jets Germany was still trying to bring into service. American Mustang pilots often described the changing face of the air war in 3 phases. Colonel John C. Meyer, who scored 24 victories, explained, "From March to June 1944, we fought the Luftwaffe's first team, experienced, aggressive, and skilled. From June to December, it was their second line, still dangerous but less coordinated. By 1945, we were shooting down students, kids who could barely fly in formation. It wasn't satisfying. It was necessary but tragic." Lieutenant Colonel John B. England, commander of the 362nd Fighter Squadron, described the psychological edge the Mustang delivered. "The Mustang didn't just give us range. It gave us dominance. German pilots knew that if they saw Mustangs, they were probably going to die. Early in the war, they would attack even when outnumbered. By late 1944, they ran the moment they spotted us. By 1945, many wouldn't even take off if Mustangs were reported nearby." Captain Charles Chuck Yeager, who would later break the sound barrier, scored 11. 5 victories flying the P-51. His words were blunt. The P-51 was an honest airplane. It had no tricks if you treated it right. Against German fighters in 44 and 45, it was like having a rifle when they still had muskets. We had every advantage: speed, range, altitude, and numbers. It wasn't a fair fight. But war isn't supposed to be fair. Perhaps the most heartfelt perspective came from the bomber crews whose survival depended on long-range escort. Technical Sergeant William McManus, a B-17 gunner with the 100th Bomb Group, recalled, "Before the Mustangs, every mission felt like suicide. We'd watch our escort turn back and knew the wolves were coming. After March 44, when the Mustangs stayed with us all the way, it was like having guardian angels. Our odds went from probably going to die to probably making it home." The Mustang's success wasn't just about its design, it was also about production. North American Aviation's factories in Inglewood, California and Dallas, Texas, achieved rates that German industry could never match. By 1944, a new Mustang rolled off the line every 63 minutes. The process borrowed from automobile assembly methods. Each worker performed a specialized task, gaining speed and precision. Paul Peters, a supervisor at Inglewood, described it this way: "We had housewives installing control cables, teenagers riveting wing panels, and older men assembling engines. Most had never built an airplane before, but the system was so well designed that within weeks they were doing perfect work. Quality control was everywhere. If something wasn't right, the line stopped until it was fixed." German production, by contrast, was chaotic. As Allied bombing forced dispersal, aircraft were built in caves, forests, and abandoned mines. Parts came from different regions, making assembly inconsistent. Quality control was nearly impossible. Many workers were forced laborers with no loyalty to the regime, and sabotage was common. Oberst Dietrich Hrabach, who commanded multiple Luftwaffe fighter units, later admitted, "We often received aircraft that looked perfect but were death traps, control cables wrongly installed, fuel lines that leaked, guns that jammed. The Americans built better planes in larger numbers with workers who wanted to win. We built worse planes in smaller numbers with workers who wanted us to lose." The impact of the P-51 Mustang extended far beyond Europe. Its ability to escort bombers deep into enemy territory proved that distance was no longer a shield. Japan felt the effects as American long-range fighters enabled direct attacks on the home islands. Even the Soviet Union took note. Soviet pilots who flew Lend-Lease P-51s were impressed by their range and reliability, and their experience helped shape the Soviet push to develop long-range escort fighters after the war. The Mustang's victory was not just about one airplane. It was proof that air power could reach anywhere, and that whoever controlled the skies could decide the outcome of wars. The VVS, the Soviet Air Force, received 10 P-51 Mustangs and tested them in detail, though they never used the aircraft in combat. The Mustang's story, however, didn't end with World War II. After the war, it continued to serve in conflicts across the globe. During the Korean War, the aircraft, redesignated as the F-51 in 1948, was used for close support missions. In 1956, the Israeli Air Force employed Mustangs during the Suez Crisis. Many air forces around the world kept them in service well into the 1980s. The Dominican Air Force finally retired its last F-51D in 1984, an incredible 40 years after Mustangs first flew over Berlin. But the Mustang's most important contribution was not just its combat record, it was its doctrine. The aircraft proved that air superiority went beyond dominating the skies above a single battlefield. True air power meant controlling the skies above entire nations. This principle became the foundation of every modern air force, first demonstrated on March 6, 1944, when American fighters circled over Berlin. Behind all the strategies and statistics were real people, young men often in their early 20s, facing extraordinary challenges. The sight of Mustangs over Berlin carried different meanings depending on who was watching. For American pilots, it was a moment of pride and certainty. Lieutenant Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group wrote to his family, "We flew over Hitler's capital today. Think about that. We took off from England, crossed Germany, circled Berlin like it was ours, because it was, and flew home again. Just 2 years ago, the Nazis were bombing London. Today, we own the sky over Berlin. The feeling is hard to describe. Pride, power, and absolute confidence that we're going to win this war." For German pilots, it meant despair. Feldwebel Rudi Müller of JG-302 wrote to his wife, "I saw them today, American fighters over Berlin, single-engine fighters. It seems impossible, but I saw it with my own eyes. If they can reach Berlin, they can reach anywhere. There is no safe place left in Germany. How do I tell you that I don't expect to survive this? How do I explain that everything we believed was wrong?" For German civilians, it shattered illusions. Berlin resident Ursula von Kardorf noted in her diary, "We were told the Americans were weak, that their Jewish-controlled society could never match German strength. Today I saw American fighters circling above, and our proud Luftwaffe was nowhere to be found. Everything we were told was lies. If they lied about this, what else did they lie about?" For Allied bomber crews, it was a lifeline. Staff Sergeant James McMahon, a ball turret gunner on the B-17 Lucky Lady, recalled, "When those Mustangs joined up with us near Berlin, I'm not ashamed to say I cried. For the first time since I started flying missions, I thought I might actually live through this war. Those little friends with the long range saved thousands of us." By the war's end, the Mustang's impact was undeniable. The Luftwaffe, once considered the most powerful air force in the world, had been reduced to nothing. The losses were staggering. From 1944 to 1945, approximately 45,000 German aircraft were destroyed. Around 15,000 Luftwaffe pilots were killed in the same period. Of those pilots who were fully operational in January 1944, fewer than 5% survived the war without injury. The destruction extended to Germany's cities and industries. A total of 61 German cities suffered more than 50% destruction from bombing. Civilian deaths from bombing ranged between 350,000 and 500,000. German industry suffered crippling losses, with 35 to 40% of total production wiped out. These statistics reflect not only a military defeat, but also the collapse of German society under relentless Allied air power. Even Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, admitted the truth after the war. At the Nuremberg trials, he was asked when he realized Germany had lost. His reply became one of the most quoted statements of the conflict. "When I saw American fighters over Berlin, the game was finished. Everything after that was just delay. More dead young men for no reason." It was a rare moment of honesty from a man known for lies and denial. The Mustang was proof of what American industry, combined with British engineering, could achieve when pushed to the limit. The P-51's development from idea to reality was one of the fastest and most effective in aviation history. The NA-73X prototype first flew on October 26, 1940, just 102 days after North American Aviation accepted the British Purchasing Commission's request. Less than 4 years later, by March 1944, the Mustang was flying over Berlin. What made the Mustang even more remarkable was its constant evolution. Each version built upon lessons learned in combat. The P-51A, powered by the Allison engine, struggled at high altitudes. The P-51B and C, fitted with the Packard-built Merlin V1650-3 engine, transformed its performance above 20,000 feet. The P-51D introduced a bubble canopy, 6 machine guns, and improved systems with the V1657 engine. The lightweight P-51H offered peak performance but arrived too late to see combat in Europe. This cycle, combat experience driving rapid design improvements, was something the German system, with its chaotic leadership and disrupted production, could not match. While German engineers produced advanced aircraft such as the TA-152H and the Me-262 jet, they lacked the stability and resources to refine or mass-produce them effectively. The appearance of Mustangs over Berlin also confirmed the vision of pre-war air power theorists like Billy Mitchell and Giulio Douhet. They had argued that bombing could decide wars by destroying enemy industry and morale, but without long-range escorts, the theory was unproven. The Mustang made daylight precision bombing possible. The contrast between American and British bombing was stark. British night raids averaged a circular error of about 3 miles, while American daylight missions, protected by Mustangs, achieved accuracy within 1,000 feet. This precision allowed targeted destruction of critical sites like ball bearing plants, synthetic fuel facilities, and aircraft factories. General Curtis LeMay, who later led the Strategic Air Command, summed it up clearly. The P-51 made strategic bombing work. Without it, we would have had to accept either unsustainable losses or ineffective night bombing. With it, we could methodically destroy specific target sets. We didn't just bomb Germany, we dismantled it piece by piece. Allied bombing campaigns in Germany were not random destruction. They were precise strikes that cut out the heart of German industry. Ball bearing production was reduced by 70%. Aviation fuel output collapsed by 95%. Synthetic rubber production dropped by 85%. Rail traffic was reduced by 75%, while canal traffic in Western Germany was completely eliminated. These targeted results were possible because P-51 Mustangs escorted bombers deep into enemy airspace, making sure they could hit critical targets and return. Each destroyed factory, every broken railway, and each fuel depot set ablaze meant German troops had fewer weapons, less mobility, and no way to sustain the fight. The sight of Mustangs circling above Berlin became one of the unforgettable images of World War II, spoken of in the same breath as the flag raising on Iwo Jima or Soviet soldiers atop the Reichstag. It was more than a battlefield moment. It was a symbol of American technological strength, industrial power, and the certainty of Allied victory. For Americans, the Mustang came to represent the nation's determination and ability to innovate. It appeared on war bond posters in Hollywood films and in celebrations after the war. People took pride in the fact that a company which had never built a fighter plane before designed and delivered the Mustang in record time. It embodied the spirit of "we can do this." For Germans, the Mustang meant something else entirely: shame and defeat. In post-war literature and films, the image of American fighters over German cities often appeared as a reminder of the regime's failure to protect its people. For Luftwaffe veterans, the trauma was personal. Heinz Kokar, writing in 1953, admitted, "For a fighter pilot, the highest duty is to defend his homeland's skies. We failed. The Mustangs over Berlin were visible proof of our failure to every German who looked up. That shame never leaves you." Military schools around the world still study the Mustang's role as a case study in how technology can change the course of a war. The lessons are timeless: range equals options. Long-range aircraft give commanders choices their enemies cannot block. Integration beats isolation. The Mustang succeeded because it was part of a coordinated system. Bombers, fighters, intelligence, logistics, and training all working together. Production wins wars. Thousands of capable planes beat a handful of advanced prototypes. The Mustang was excellent, but most importantly, there were thousands of them. Pilot quality matters. Even the best aircraft means little without well-trained pilots. The U.S. produced aviators with heavy flight hours and realistic combat training, ensuring the Mustang reached its full potential. Adaptation is survival. The Americans adjusted tactics, technology, and training as the war evolved. The Germans, bound by rigid doctrine and political interference, could not keep up. Modern air forces still apply these principles every day, from long-range strike planning to the value of industrial capacity. The lessons began when Mustangs first appeared over Berlin. March 6, 1944 was more than a date on the calendar. It was the moment Nazi Germany's assumptions collapsed. The Reich had trusted distance, confident that Allied fighters could not reach its capital. They relied on elite Luftwaffe pilots and advanced fighters to protect their skies. That morning, the Mustang shattered those illusions in minutes. Germany's leaders had been certain that America could not project power across the Atlantic effectively. They dismissed American industry as clumsy, American technology as second-rate, and American pilots as inexperienced and soft. Every one of those assumptions was proven false the moment Mustangs roared over Berlin. It was undeniable proof. Propaganda could not explain it away. Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most respected fighter commanders, later wrote, "March 6, 1944 was the day we lost the war. Not when Berlin fell, not when Hitler died, but when American fighters appeared over our capital. Everything after was just the playing out of a foregone conclusion." The Mustang's impact went far beyond air battles. It exposed the weakness of Nazi ideology. If the Reich could not defend Berlin itself, then how strong was it really? If their claims about American weakness were lies, what else was false? For German civilians, the Mustang became a silent messenger of truth, proving the Nazi worldview was built on lies. Yet the Mustang's success came at a price. In the European theater, 2,520 P-51s were lost in combat. Each loss meant a young pilot who would never return. The 357th Fighter Group alone lost over 100 men killed in action. They were students, athletes, husbands, and fathers who gave everything. Lieutenant Colonel Sidney Brooks, commanding officer of the 339th Fighter Group, was killed on March 31, 1944, when his P-51B was struck by flak near Brunswick. He was 28 years old, married, and left behind 2 children who would grow up without their father. His story was repeated thousands of times across the air war. Even those who survived carried heavy burdens. Captain Don Gentile, one of the top Mustang aces with 21. 83 confirmed aerial victories, lived through combat only to die in 1951 during a training accident in a T-33 jet. Many Mustang pilots carried psychological wounds for the rest of their lives, haunted by what they had seen and endured. Still, their sacrifices reshaped the war. They forced the Luftwaffe to fight over its own homeland on unequal terms, and broke its strength forever. From the moment Mustangs reached Berlin, the Luftwaffe was no longer a threat. By May 8, 1945, VE Day, American Mustangs patrolled the skies over a defeated Germany without meeting a single German plane. The once feared Luftwaffe that had dominated Europe in 1940 had ceased to exist. Its planes were destroyed or grounded without fuel, its pilots were dead, wounded, or prisoners, and its bases were reduced to rubble. The Mustang had done its job. It not only won the skies, it helped win the war. From March 6, 1944 to May 8, 1945, a span of just 14 months, the Allies achieved one of the most decisive victories in military history. At the heart of that success was the P-51 Mustang, the fighter that turned Allied air power from a costly gamble into an unstoppable force. In that short period, Mustang pilots flew more than 213,000 sorties. They claimed 4,950 aerial victories, destroyed 4,131 enemy aircraft on the ground, dropped 31,000 tons of bombs, and fired an incredible 99 million rounds of ammunition. But behind these staggering numbers were young Americans, most only 22 years old, flying aluminum machines powered by Packard-built Merlin engines. These men, backed by technology, training, and industry, dismantled one of the most feared air forces in history. Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke, one of the war's most respected fighter leaders, later summed it up. They were magnificent opponents who were simply overwhelmed. We had more of everything, more planes, more fuel, more pilots, more training, more range. The Mustang gave us the power to apply that more wherever we wanted. Once we could escort to Berlin, victory became inevitable. For Major Hans Kogler, Seeing Mustangs over Brandenburg on March 6, 1944 was more than a battlefield shock. It was a glimpse of the future. The P-51 had shown that technology could erase distance, that industrial capacity could defeat individual skill, and that a disciplined, organized approach could crush even the most daring improvisation. German pilots weren't just fighting a superior aircraft. They were facing the combined industrial and organizational strength of the United States, projected across the Atlantic and deep into their homeland. Hermann Göring himself admitted that when he saw American fighters over Berlin, he knew the war was lost. Yet the meaning of that moment went far beyond one commander's confession. The arrival of the Mustang marked a turning point in warfare. When air power became truly strategic, when industry outweighed tradition, and when organized efficiency triumphed over individual heroism. Every German pilot who encountered Mustangs in those skies was witnessing a revolution in warfare that would echo through the decades. The ability of America to project decisive power across vast distances set the stage for every military operation that followed, from Korea to Vietnam, from the Gulf War to Kosovo. The P-51 Mustang did more than escort bombers or shoot down fighters. It destroyed the myth of Nazi invincibility and proved that free societies, despite their apparent disorder, could out-innovate, outproduce, and outfight totalitarian regimes. Those German pilots who looked up at silver Mustangs in 1944 were, without realizing it, seeing the end of their force, the fall of their nation, and the collapse of an ideology built on lies of superiority. Within 14 months, the Luftwaffe was shattered, Germany was occupied, and its ideology discredited. The sound of the Mustang's Merlin engine became forever linked to that transformation. For American veterans, it was the sound of victory. For German veterans, it marked the beginning of the end. For historians, it became the sound of modern warfare itself, the moment when industrial democracy proved its strength on the global stage. But the legacy of the Mustang went beyond destruction. The German pilots who survived the war later helped build the democratic Luftwaffe of post-war Germany, allied with the very nation whose Mustangs had once shot them down. Men like Johannes Steinhoff went on to serve as Chief of Staff of the new German Air Force, and later as Chairman of NATO's Military Committee. By the 1980s, former enemies stood side by side as partners, defending freedom together. Adolf Galland, who had once been Germany's General of Fighters, captured this transformation best. In 1984, at a reunion in San Antonio, Texas, he raised a glass to his former foes and said, "You shocked us when your Mustangs appeared over Berlin. You shocked us with your industry, your technology, your determination. But the greatest shock came after the war, when you helped us rebuild, when you defended us against Soviet aggression, when you became our friends." The Mustangs didn't just end a war. They began a peace. For that, we are forever grateful. The story had come full circle. The same Mustangs that once terrified Luftwaffe pilots over Berlin ultimately paved the way for a peace that has lasted more than 8 decades. Their roar in the skies was more than the sound of combat. It was the sound of transformation, of victory, and of lasting freedom.